They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's written by ghosts, its words etched into the ruins of shattered cities. In the spring of 1945, one city was about to become the world's largest tombstone, Berlin. The war in Europe, a 6-year storm of destruction that had swallowed continents and claimed tens of millions of lives, was hurtling toward its brutal end. The Western Allies were deep inside Germany, a relentless tide of men and steel. But from the east, something else was coming, something apocalyptic. The Soviet Union, forged in unimaginable suffering and driven by a burning desire for vengeance, had gathered one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. Well over 1.5 million soldiers, backed by tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, were poised to strike the final mortal blow against the heart of the Nazi regime. There was no grand strategy for survival. All that remained was a choice in how to die. This is the story of that final, agonizing countdown. The story of the last 10 days, when an empire built to last 1,000 years collapsed into a hellscape of fire, blood, and surrender. For the defenders of Berlin, there's no hope, only a choice in how they meet their end. This is the story of the final countdown, the apocalyptic last stand for the capital of a doomed empire. By mid-April 1945, the map of Europe was bleeding. In the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine, but their commanders had decided to leave the capture of Berlin to the Soviets. In the east, the Red Army stood coiled on the banks of the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from the capital. The final offensive wasn't just a military operation, it was a race, fueled by the ambition and rivalry of one man, Joseph Stalin. The master of the Kremlin was obsessed with capturing Berlin. He saw it as the ultimate prize, a symbol of Soviet triumph that would secure his dominance in post-war Europe. To take the city, he pitted his two best commanders against each other, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev. Stalin deliberately left the boundary between their armies blurry as they approached Berlin, turning a military goal into a brutal competition. Whoever reached the Reichstag first would be a hero. It was a rivalry that would cost tens of thousands of his own men their lives. Facing this onslaught was a ghost army. What was left of Germany's military was a shadow. Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthold Heinrici, was tasked with defending the city's approaches. Heinrici was a master of defense, but he had almost nothing to work with. His forces were a patchwork of exhausted Wehrmacht divisions and Waffen-SS units. The last line of defense was a series of low hills west of the Oder River, the Silo Heights. Heinrici knew he couldn't stop the Soviets here, but he could make them pay for every inch of ground. He fortified the heights, correctly guessing this would be Zhukov's main line of attack. These would become the gates of Berlin. The storm broke on April 16th. In the pre-dawn darkness, Zhukov unleashed a bombardment of unbelievable ferocity. Tens of thousands of artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers fired nearly 2 million shells, turning the sky orange and the earth into a churning sea. Then Zhukov tried a bizarre tactic. He ordered 143 anti-aircraft searchlights to be aimed directly at the German positions, hoping to blind them. Instead, the beams bounced off the morning mist, perfectly silhouetting his own attacking soldiers for the German machine gunners. General Heinrici had played a brilliant, cynical card. Expecting the massive bombardment, he had quietly pulled most of his troops back to a second defensive line just hours before. Zhukov's artillery had pulverized empty trenches. As Soviet infantry and tanks surged forward, they got bogged down in a swampy, cratered landscape, taking withering fire from an enemy they thought was already dead. For 4 agonizing days, the Battle of the Silo Heights raged. It was a meat grinder of horrific intensity. Soviet tanks, stuck in the mud, were easy prey for teenage boys armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Under immense pressure from Zhukov, Soviet commanders threw wave after wave of men against the German guns, but the sheer weight of numbers was just too much. By April 19th, after suffering catastrophic losses, as many as 30,000 Dezhukov's forces finally broke through. The gates of Berlin had been breached. The road to the capital was open. With the Silo Heights shattered, the Soviet pincers began to close. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, the first Soviet artillery shells slammed into the city, thunderous, unwelcome birthday greeting. The shelling wouldn't stop until the city fell. Berlin was subjected to a relentless bombardment, a storm of steel that seemed to eclipse everything that had come before. By April 25th, Berlin was completely cut off from the outside world. The capital of the Reich had become a Kessel, a cauldron, sealed and boiling with over 2 million civilians and a motley garrison of defenders. The man put in charge of this hopeless defense was General Helmuth Weidling. Just a day earlier, Hitler had ordered him executed by firing squad after a misunderstanding. After Weidling cleared his name in a tense meeting in the Vorbunker, he was given command of a city that was already a tomb. His forces were a tragic parody of an army. He had about 45,000 soldiers from depleted army and Waffen-SS divisions, plus police, sailors, and around 40,000 men from the Volkssturme People's Militia. These were old men, some in their 60s, armed with ancient rifles. Most tragically, there were the children of the Hitler Youth, some as young as 14, fighting with a fanatical courage born of years of indoctrination. They fought with suicidal bravery, ambushing Soviet tanks in the rubble. For civilians, life became a nightmare. They huddled in cellars, the constant roar of artillery a soundtrack to their terror. As Soviet troops advanced, some Berliners hung white flags from their windows, an act of immense courage as SS squads roamed the streets, executing anyone who showed signs of surrender. The city itself was the main fortification. The fighting was brutal and intimate. It was a war of streets, houses, and rooms. The thirst for vengeance among many Soviet soldiers whose homeland had been ravaged by the Wehrmacht was palpable. As they advanced, stories of atrocities, particularly the mass rape of German women, spread terror through the city. While Berlin burned, its architect festered 50 feet below ground. In the Vorbunker, Adolf Hitler was completely detached from the reality unfolding above. The atmosphere was a concrete tomb, thick with despair and cigarette smoke. Here, Hitler shuffled the flags of non-existent armies on his map, raging at his generals and accusing them of betrayal. Hitler flew into a volcanic rage. He screamed that the war was lost, that he had been betrayed. He declared for the first time that he would stay in Berlin and shoot himself. In the days that followed, he kept asking one frantic question: where is Wenck? He pinned his last, desperate hopes on General Walther Wenck's 12th Army to break the siege. But Wenck's army was itself being destroyed. It was a fantasy. In this subterranean madhouse, the final personal drama played out. In the early hours of April 29th, as Soviet troops fought just over a mile away, Hitler married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. Immediately after, he dictated his last will and political testament, a final, venomous screed, blaming the war on international jury and expelling his most loyal deputies for treason. The final countdown was reaching its last seconds. The symbolic heart of Berlin, and the ultimate target for Stalin, was the Reichstag. It had been a burnt-out shell since 1933 and had no real strategic value, but as a symbol, it was everything. Stalin demanded its capture in time for the May Day parade in Moscow, fixation that would cost thousands more Soviet lives. The final assault began on April 29. The Reichstag itself was a fortress, defended by a determined force of around 1,500 German soldiers, SS, and sailors. They were heavily entrenched. The large square before it, the Königsplatz, was a killing field, swept by machine gun and anti-tank fire. On the morning of April 30th, the Soviets launched their first direct assault. They were beaten back. All day, they pounded the building with artillery. Inside, the fighting was hellish. Each room was a separate battle. Hand-to-hand combat raged in the grand, smoke-filled hallways. Finally, late that evening, Soviet soldiers stormed the main entrance. Around 10:45 p.m., two sergeants, Mikhail Yagorov and Melitin Kanteria, were handed a red banner. Under fire, they scrambled up the shattered dome and hoisted the hammer and sickle over the heart of the thousand-year Reich. The iconic moment, later restaged for a famous photograph, symbolized the final, crushing victory. Just hours earlier, a few hundred yards away, the war had ended for its architect. In the Vorbunker, at around 3:30 p.m. on April 30th, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun said their goodbyes. They retreated into his personal study. A moment later, a single gunshot. Hitler's valet entered the room to find him slumped on the sofa, dead from a gunshot to the head. Eva Braun was beside him, dead from a cyanide capsule. Following his instructions, their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery Garden, placed in a shell crater, doused with gasoline, and set on fire as Soviet shells rained down. The man who wanted to build an empire from ashes had become ash himself. With Hitler dead, the chain of command disintegrated. Joseph Goebbels, Chancellor for a single day, had his 6 children poisoned before he and his wife committed suicide. It fell to General Weidling to end the suffering. Defying Hitler's orders, forbidding surrender, Weidling knew any more fighting was a pointless massacre. On the morning of May 2nd, he arranged a ceasefire with the Soviets. He was taken to see General Vasily Chukov, where he signed the order for all German forces in Berlin to surrender. An announcement was broadcast over loudspeakers. "I hereby order the immediate cessation of all hostilities." Slowly, an eerie silence fell over the ruins. For the first time in weeks, the guns were quiet. Soldiers and civilians emerged into a city that was almost unrecognizable. It was a landscape of death. In the battle for Berlin, over 80,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed. German military losses were nearly 100,000 killed or missing, and tens of thousands of civilians had perished in the crossfire. The city was a wasteland. 6 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany signed the unconditional surrender, formally ending the Second World War in Europe. The final countdown had ended. The world had entered 0 hour. The fall of Berlin was more than the capture of a city. It was the violent death of an ideology that had plunged the world into darkness. It was a climax of unbelievable brutality, a final spasm of a war that had redefined human suffering. The stories of the soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, and the leaders who collapsed into madness are a permanent, harrowing reminder of the cost of fanaticism. If you appreciate stories that bring the past to life, consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support helps us continue to explore these vital moments in history. We also invite you to watch our next video on the Nuremberg trials, where the world sought to bring justice to the ruins left behind. Thank you for watching.